Well, I'm sure that most of us, if in fact not all of us, when we finally get around to swallowing the bitter pill that we are not immortal after all, that we begin thinking about situations that may warrant end-of-life care, and also the degree to which we will submit to medical technology. We are adamant, or so I hear it expressed throughout this congregation and in liberal circles more generally, that we want to fully control the last stages of our life, implying that we want to decide for ourselves when to pull the plug and minimize any needless suffering. We often hear people say they're not afraid of death, they're just afraid of the process of dying. Well, if that's basically true, that we really don't fear death, which we are, quite frankly, more inclined to believe when it still feels a good way off in the future, and we're pretty fit in mind and body, then why has Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel caused such a huge stir in his recent essay in The Atlantic called Why I Hope to Die at 75? Aside from being the brother of Chicago's Mayor Rahm Emanuel, he is an oncologist and chair of the Medical Ethics and Health Policy Department at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Emanuel is currently 57 years old. He poses an enormously important philosophical question, guaranteed to shake up even those among us who insist that quality of life weighs more importantly than longevity. We intend to decline any end-of-life medical treatment, but for most of us, our thinking is still guided somewhat unrealistically, guided by a belief that we won't be facing crucial decision-making in healthcare until we're much further along in our years. Now, Dr. Emanuel claims, and he's probably right, that in our minds, we believe we will continue to be as vital as we are now, all the way to the end. And then, well, some disease or condition may present issues of accepting life support or not when we're really old. In this way, we remain convinced that we truly uphold the quality of life as a supreme virtue. Now, holding fast to such a belief that we'll keep on going to the end and life expectancy is pushing new boundaries flies in the face of a reality we prefer to ignore. We all deteriorate, we all slow down, we all get disabilities. Analyzing our propensity to disregard our inevitable loss of vitality and the onset of disabilities, Dr. Emanuel cites a theory developed at Stanford University in the early 1980s on the compression of morbidity. The theory projected that as we get older, we're actually going to become healthier through diet and medical science, and that falling apart, the disabilities, the dementia will become, well, actually just very small parts of our lives. Wow. People naturally grabbed hold of this idea. That sounds really pretty good, but unfortunately, it's not true. Yes, we live longer than people used to, but as we age, we have actually added more years of disability. We live longer but with more functional limitations, less able to move around, more mental limitations, more psychological depression and other mental problems. I want to quote Dr. Emmanuel exactly. This is what he says. Once I have lived to 75, my approach to my health care will completely change. I won't actively end my life, but I won't try to prolong it either. At 75 and beyond, I will need a good reason to even visit a doctor and take any medical test or treatment, no matter how routine and painless. I will stop getting any regular preventive tests, screenings, or interventions. I will accept only palliative, not curative treatments if I am suffering pain or other disabilities. Age 65 will be my last colonoscopy. No screening for prostate cancer at any age. After 75, if I develop cancer, I will refuse treatment. Similarly, no cardiac stress test, no pacemaker, and certainly no implantable defibrillator. No heart valve replacement or bypass surgery. Flu shots are out. Certainly, if there were a flu pandemic, a young person who has yet to live a complete life ought to get the vaccine or any antiviral drugs. A big challenge is antibiotics for pneumonia or skin and urinary infections. Antibiotics are cheap and largely effective in curing infections. It is really hard to say no, but as Osler reminds us, death from these infections is quick and relatively painless, so no to antibiotics. Let me tell you about Sir William Osler, who wrote in his turn-of-the-century textbook, The Principles and Practice of Medicine. He writes, pneumonia may well be called the friend of the aged. Taken off by it in an acute, short, not often painful illness, the old man escapes those cold gradations of decay. Man escapes those cold gradations of decay, so stressing to himself and to his friends. So Dr. Emmanuel has no issue at 75 and beyond of simply letting go, dying of pneumonia if need be, in order not to suffer any cold gradations of decay that predictably visit us in old age. Now, he has received an abundance of pushback, most notably from his 3 daughters and from his brother, the mayor, and somewhat younger. He refers to them as the American immortal, those for whom it is almost a religion to live as long as possible. They change their diet, exercise like mad, take protein concoctions, and all other supplements. They fail to admit that you really don't get healthy as you age. No matter how hard you try, a lot of things creep up in you. We all deteriorate. Now, for those of us who are here this morning and are young adults, and 75 seems about as far away as Jupiter, I want you to kind of relate to these thoughts and have a chance to even meditate on this in terms of what if you heard these words from your own parents. And chances are your parents will probably fall in between the ages of 55 and 75. And what have they said to you? This is my philosophy. After 75 or at 75, I'm going to say no to any medical intervention whatsoever. What's going to be your response? Are you going to selfishly say no and contradict them and say how important they are and they got to be there for the grandkids and all that? Or are you going to be able to listen carefully to their idea of what's important in the last years of life. For Dr. Emmanuel, 75 is the tipping point, at least statistically, for defying the odds of encroaching disabilities while feeling a sense of completion of a life well lived. He has no intention of engaging in euthanasia or suicide. He makes no claim that those who wish to live as long as possible are unethical or wrong. He does not dismiss people who want to live on despite their physical and mental limitations. He says, I'm not even trying to convince anyone I'm right. Indeed, I often advise people in this age group on how to get the best medical care available in the United States for their ailments. That is their choice, and I want to support them. It appears we're dealing with a startling philosophy of life that runs contrary to all that we wanted to believe about medicine and also about the expectation that we must approach old age with courage, or being able to adapt, as our reading said this morning. Take our hits in order to remain connected to those who love us. We don't want to give the impression as we age of ever giving up. That would be cowardly, not the good soldier approach to our decline. We feel, after all, somehow this inherent obligation to hang around for as long as possible. Now, Dr. Emmanuel fully acknowledges that his philosophy for avoiding the slow constriction of activities and aspirations imposed by aging runs contrary to evolution's role to inculcate in us the drive to live for as long as possible. We are programmed, he says, to struggle to survive. Consequently, most people feel there is something vaguely wrong with saying 75 and no more. We are eternally optimistic Americans who chafe at limits, especially limits imposed on our lives. We are sure that we are exceptional. What does he mean by exceptional? Well, it's our inclination to look at old and productive people like Betty White, Queen Elizabeth, Jimmy Carter, people we know personally who are over 75 and remain creative and engaged, and then convince ourselves that, well, we too are certainly like that. We're somehow exempt from the normal decline. We're exceptional to those rules. I mean, look at what George Burns did at 100. I could do that, I'm sure. Old age is great. But there are always going to be outliers. In a country of 300 million people, a list of even, say, 1,000 people who remain vital after the age of 75 comprises a very select group of outliers. A disturbing personal question that Emmanuel forces us to consider is whether or not we can, whether or not we should live our lives believing that we are going to be one of those rare outliers. Because odds are we're not. And that's why, perhaps, after all the pushback that Emmanuel has received from people like me, who believes he's some kind of weird extremist, that's all tempered with the fact that healthcare professionals, from nurses to doctors to surgeons, gerontologists, they're all mostly in agreement with him that the odds against us are staggering. This is their field. They know. Now, let's be clear. Dr. Emmanuel is not endorsing death panels. He's neither trying to save resources nor ration health care. The question he poses is one we often pose to ourselves, although we seldom have the grit to answer it honestly. And the question is, really, so what is a good life? Beyond stipulating in our medical directives that we want do not resuscitate when all hell breaks loose, how honestly do we examine what a good life means to us while we are in a non-emergency status? What are our priorities aside from living longer? Is it more important to live in a certain way that underscores our values and beliefs? What is it that we actually want when we get towards the end of life? What do we want? Which is undeniably a reality when crossing the threshold of 75. Wow, that's a good time to ask. What do we want? Emmanuel says that 75 defines a clear point in time to think about the end of our lives and engage with the deepest existential questions and ponder what do we want to leave for our children, grandchildren, our community, our friends, the world. Now, of course, many of us tackle these deep questions hypothetically back in college days. But Emmanuel insists that the specificity of reaching age 75 means that we can no longer ignore to think about and answer for ourselves these difficult questions. So in my way of thinking, and perhaps yours too, I'm thinking all along here, I really do want to hang around and watch my grandchildren grow up, and I want to see them graduate college, and I want to see them find loved ones, and I want to see them begin new families, and then they begin new families, and just kind of be around. But maybe it's just that I'm naturally curious about things that I want to see that. But honestly, even in my 30s, I had this desire for hanging around on this blessed earth for at least long enough to see several generations unfold. I always imagined playing on the floor with my grandchildren as I did with my children. So far, so good, but I don't think I'm done getting grandchildren, so I don't know what's going to happen in the years ahead. Dr. Emmanuel counters, I am very committed to seeing my grandchildren. And what I really care about is how they remember me. And I want them to remember me vital, doing crazy things with them on the swings and slides and playgrounds, and maybe taking them on trips and, kayaking around the Everglades or up in Alaska. I don't want them to remember me as frail or demented or repeating myself. I would think that would actually be a tragedy. I think there's a very important connection to be made with grandchildren, but I think if you're just confined to a chair, or you're demented, or just very slow, it may not be as meaningful as we try to project. And so he really boils it down to the very rudimentary basics. He says, look, by 75, it's really a complete life. You will have grown up, you have picked a career, worked hard in the career, had kids, raised them, had grandchildren. What more could you ask? I mean, that is a very rich, rich life. What more can you ask? The prescription is not to end your life at 75. I mean, if you're healthy and vital and creative going into your 80s, wonderful. Consider yourself blessed. But the caveat is that if you invite medicine into your life to prolong it past the age of 75, he's saying, think again. Think, what more do you really want? At 75, you're already in physical and mental decline. How much longer do you intend to push it? And why? Dr. Emmanuel is obviously not alone in his thinking. Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon in Boston, professor at Harvard, staff writer at The New Yorker, has just published a book called Being Mortal, What Matters in the End? There we go, that same question. What matters in the end? And to be very honest and frank with you, I have never really looked deeply into that question, the question of what matters in the end. It's not from a lack of courage on my part. It's really, it's because I always assumed that I'm supposed to live for as long as I can and stay connected to future generations, regardless how I felt, how I looked, or even how little I could contribute. And so now we're being confronted by this revolutionary idea. Although medical technology can extend our stay in this world well beyond our years of vitality, perhaps we have neglected to consider what's important for us aside from just living longer. We have done little to prepare for the end of life, assuming, I guess, that it was just our duty to try to last forever. But isn't it somewhat liberating? Threatening to be sure, and I'm just trying this on for size. Isn't it somewhat liberating in conceding that longevity, for the sake of longevity, feels a little unsettling? Does it not essentially free us up to consider our own priorities in the later stages of life? Look at all the time we invest in learning how to live. This new concept of hoping to die at 75 suggests we need to learn more about dying. We need to learn how to let go when our lives compromise the way we really want to live. Sometimes the decisions come more easily than at others. I'll always remember it was about 2 years ago I was called into the ICU where a man had a stroke right where the brainstem meets the spinal cord. And his choice was being confined to a respirator for the rest of his life with no speech, no mobility, or pulling the plug. He chose the latter. And I did a spontaneous memorial service in that hospital room with him listening to every word I said, because intellectually he was fully competent. And in that room, in that ICU around his bed, we all wept, but we wept because of the tragic circumstances that surrounded this man, not the choice that he made, which we all concurred was the best. Now, this is a very different scenario from that of a relatively healthy person refusing to receive any and all routine medical care after age 75, rather than succumb to the slow restriction of activities and aspirations, vulnerable to an inevitable onslaught of disabilities. Dr. Emmanuel posits the view that we need to think clearly how we want to spend the rest of our lives in keeping with our priorities for what we value. What a radical departure from the assumption that we need to live as long as possible. But Emmanuel's argument holds enormous validity because his very basic humanity seems to just ooze out, or is it evolutionary biology which forces him to say, and I quote, "I reserve the right to change my mind." Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but I'll never look at 75 the same way ever again.